Okay, well, welcome back to Taiwan, Vitalik.
Thank you.
This is your, I don't know, nth trip here. Hope you've had enough tea on this trip. You know, I think people know who you are, so maybe we can just dive right into Ethereum 2.0.
Sure.
I know there was a spec freeze recently. When can we expect essentially this to come online?
Sure. So just to kind of go through the near to midterm roadmap a bit more generally, the plan right now is that the client developers, so the companies that are making the actual software clients that Ethereum 2.0 nodes will run, have already for a couple of months also been doing testnets, and they're already starting to push for interoperability between different clients. So the next big milestone is basically to have a testnet that has multiple clients inside of it. And that's something we're hoping for in probably a couple of months, and maybe sooner, we'll see.
What will be the primary user benefits?
Yeah, so I guess so to just keep going through the history, because like more and more user benefits, I guess, will kind of come online as more things launch. So hopefully very early next year, the actual phase 0 mainnet would launch, and phase 0 is just proof of stake. So no sharding, but there will be a proof of stake chain. And that doesn't really give much benefit to existing users, except if you want to, because the proof of stake chain will point to proof of work block headers. You could actually use the proof of stake chain as a kind of light client for the proof of work chain. And so the proof of stake light clients are much more efficient than the proof of work ones, so that's something that people might want to do, but that's probably the main benefit.
I was going to say, what's the target for that? Because you said earlier in the year, I think the press has been saying January.
January 3 is kind of the dream goal.
That's pretty specific.
We'll see, 11th anniversary of the Holy Father's launch. So that's phase 0, right? So phase 1, which is sharding of data. And so no smart contract execution, but just shardings of data. That's something that we want to have a spec freeze for at the end of September. And that's something that will hopefully go live on mainnet at sometime next year. And it's also something that people are going to be working on testnets for in parallel to making the testnets for phase 0 work well. So what phase 1 will provide is this data platform, and there's a bunch of ways in which you can use that to start making very scalable applications that kind of combine together the existing Ethereum computation layer with more scalable data on the Ethereum 2 side. And then phase 2 is when scalable computation and scalable smart contract execution goes live on Ethereum 2.0. That's maybe end of next year, we'll see. And that's when the kind of system goes online with its full promised functionality. And the goal there is to basically have Ethereum, but 1,000 times more scalable, and 3 times shorter block times, and better light clients, and a better, more general purpose virtual machine.
What is the actual feel for how much more scalable it would be? Are you being literal with 1,000 times, or is that?
So the numbers that we're considering right now are 1,024 shards multiplied by about 15 kilobytes a second on every shard. So 15 kilobytes a second multiplied by 1,024 would give 15 megabytes a second. And if you just stick transactions into that with some Merkle proofs and make it be a kilobyte a transaction, then it's 15,000 transactions a second compared to the current 15. But if you start stacking other layer 2 schemes on top, so you do a ZK rollup sort of thing, then you can compress a transaction down to 10 bytes, and then we're talking about somewhere in the high hundreds of thousands of transactions a second or more, which is all theoretically possible, but that would require a bit more infrastructure.
And that's beyond Visa level, I think, right?
And I definitely think that ETH2, the full vision, will have all the scalability that we need.
That sounds great, but how do we encourage people to get involved into the POS system or become a validator?
Sure. So becoming a validator is this sort of new feature that ETH2 will introduce because it is a proof of stake blockchain. And so anyone who has ETH will be able to take their ETH, deposit it into the deposit contract at the beginning on the ETH1 side, eventually on the ETH2 side. And when you do your deposit, you would also specify a cryptographic key, and then you would just be able to run a node that uses that cryptographic key to sign blocks and become a validator. So what's the incentive for that? Basically rewards. So you'd be able to get a reward of somewhere between like 2 to 6, maybe % a year, depending on how many other people validate.
Do you see custody issues arising from that key management? I mean,
ooh, so it's a good question. So one of the things that we've been kind of working hard at over the last 4 years or so is just thinking about how to make the economics of validation more friendly. So viewers might have heard of the slashing mechanism that basically says if you use your key to do something that's clearly bad, like signing 2 conflicting blocks at the same time, signing blocks that are invalid, then you get penalized. But the penalty, we have this mechanism where the penalty is proportional to the number of other validators that misbehave at the same time. And the idea there is that if it's a coordinated attack, then you penalize it heavily, but if it's just one guy having a software glitch on their computer, then it doesn't really do much to the network, and so we barely penalize it at all. So the idea there is to try to have incentives that are kind of pretty forgiving to users in the normal case, but can still deter actual attacks.
So it sounds like it's really rely on the client implementation stability. Mm-hmm. So how do we prove that all of the client implementation is correct?
That's a good question. I mean, fortunately, we do have years of experience doing this for Ethereum 1.0. And so the challenge even in the Ethereum 1.0 chain, right, is that we have a spec, the yellow paper, and then there's some other specs, and then there's these maybe 3 to 5 different client implementations of Ethereum. So you have Go, Parity, Python, some others. And we have this process where we have people that are just dedicated to writing tests, and then one of the clients is used to generate the tests. So you basically take like some set of transactions or blocks and you just run them, and it returns like what is the state of the blockchain, like what are the hashes of everything if you process all of this data. So one client generates the test and all the other clients run the tests, see if they all match. If there's even a single mismatch, then developers yell at each other and figure things out until everyone does agree. You repeat this a bunch of times. At the same time, you have security audits running on the clients, you have bounties. So it's a process that we are very much used to, and we have, I think, figured out how to make work pretty effectively for ETH1. For ETH2, we are going to have more client implementations, obviously, but I think the fundamental process is pretty similar. And we are also taking a lot of things that we've learned from the ETH1 process and trying to improve it.
What happens to miners in 2.0? Is the idea that they'll become validators, or how do you see that migrating?
Mining and validating are kind of different specialties. And one requires running these really powerful GPU farms. Yeah. The other requires having ETH and having some ability to have a computer and just keep it running on most of the time, but a lot less emphasis on that. Mm-hmm. So the kind of honest and blunt answer is that most of the mining hardware is not going to be too useful in ETH2. But I mean, in the long run, there are things that you can repurpose it to. So for example, if zero-knowledge proofs become popular, then one of the properties that zero-knowledge proofs have, right, is that they're very expensive to generate. So a zero-knowledge proof of a computation takes maybe 1,000, anywhere from 100 to 100,000 times more computational power to generate than it takes to run the computation, but then you can verify it extremely quickly. And so you could potentially take a lot of the high-powered mining gear and use it for proof generation, and that would facilitate making blockchain platforms more scalable, because you would just have this one class of actors generate these proofs and burn a lot of computation on doing that, and then everyone else would be able to save the effort and just quickly verify those proofs.
So does POS make Ethereum more centralized? Because one of the things that I find interesting is the regulatory side, right? Mm-hmm. the SEC has said that Bitcoin and Ethereum are the only two digital assets that are sufficiently decentralized to be not considered unregulated securities. So I think from an investment perspective, that's why, part of the reason why Bitcoin and Ethereum are expected to outperform, because they'll get, inflows. So is there have you guys had any discussions on that? Any thoughts about, from a regulatory perspective, does that make it look more like a problematic asset, or?
Yeah, so everything we've heard from a regulatory point of view suggests that proof of stake is not going to make the chain itself, or the coin itself, more security-ish.
Yeah.
Now, there might be ways of being a validator that are kind of illegal or regulated.
Yeah.
So, for example, if someone issues a token that basically is here's my 1,000 ether that I'm putting into a validator, and I'm going to take out the cost of running the validator, and I'm going to give back 1,030 ether, then that could easily be a security under many countries' regulations. But just kind of being a validator the default way, everything we've seen seems like that should be fine. And I know Virgil even went and checked Sharia compliance of Ethereum, and I think the result was that it's fine, and it would even continue to be fine if it became proof of stake.
Yeah.
So,
do you have any statistics around that, or anecdotes perhaps? I mean, we've seen some studies around the Gini coefficient of the Bitcoin ecosystem. What is your feeling about the Ethereum ecosystem? Is it somewhat more or less decentralized than the Bitcoin ones?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's definitely a point that a lot of people bring up, and Nouriel, our famous, wonderful friend, Dr. Doom, or whatever his nickname is, loves pointing out that Bitcoin's Gini coefficient is the same as North Korea. And when we had our debate in Seoul, I pointed out the 5 different ways in which that statistic is totally misleading.
Yeah.
So it's actually kind of hilarious. It's really misleading, right? So first of all, he was comparing the wealth Gini coefficient of Bitcoin to the income Gini coefficient of I think North Korea, but wealth Gini coefficients are always much higher than income Gini coefficients, right? So for the US, for example, the income Gini is around, I think, 0.45 or 55, but the wealth Gini is 0.8 something. And so Bitcoin, according to his numbers, was pretty high up, but it's still within the range of countries. So that's the first mistake. The second mistake is that addresses are not people, right? And every person has a bunch of these kind of dust accounts that have 0.000 whatever coins that just are sitting there doing nothing because they're not using those addresses anymore. And the third thing is obviously that cryptocurrency is still a niche interest, and so inequality of holdings of cryptocurrency doesn't just reflect inequality between people, it also reflects basically inequality of how much people care about crypto. And so if you take any kind of item that people have different levels of interest in, inequality of ownership of bottles of green tea, the Gini on that's got to be huge, right? And nobody complains about green tea being totalitarian and plutocratic.
The other thing that we talked about yesterday is electricity. In the first 10 years, the distribution of light bulbs was very unfair.
Yeah, so I think basically there's a lot of people that way over exaggerate it. I mean, on the other hand, there's legitimate concerns too.
Definitely.
I definitely think that the fact that most units of most cryptocurrencies basically got distributed within a couple of years is a big a mistake in a lot of cases. Now, well, maybe a mistake, but sometimes it's there's not necessarily much better ways to do it. So for example, in the beginning, right, for Ethereum, we wanted to have a higher mining issuance, in part because we did not want the kind of early pre-sale buyers to be the only people that would have a chance to get in. But then what we see now is that whereas mining was kind of perceived as, and really was, this kind of democratic, anyone can spin up a computer and do it, way of getting coins in the 2009 up to 2013, ASIC resistant mining up to maybe 2017 era. These days the mining is just corporatized to hell, and you need $10 million of non-recurring expenses to get in. So it's if you release coins by mining, it's hardly democratic at all in any way.
On that topic of democracy and transparency, I know you were at an event last night here in Taipei around Radical Exchange, which itself was based on the book by Eric Posner and Glenn Wheel at Radical Markets. Can you tell us well, you obviously wrote a book review on that. You have thoughts on this book, but how does this relate to decentralized finance? How does this relate to the topics we just discussed?
Sure. So the core idea behind kind of radical marketism is that you can use insights from economics and game theory and mechanism design to come up with kind of what we call institutions, kind of sets of rules for how people can interact and like what the incentives behind different things are and kind of how resources can be managed that basically do a better job of creating a society which is kind of efficient, free, egalitarian, fair, all of these nice things than things like capitalism and democracy do today. Right? And so, like, you might think, oh well, in the real world we have trade-offs. So like, how can you make things better without making other things worse? But like, at the same time, if you think about these things as a kind of social technology, right? If you think about even just the concept of private property, things like markets, just democratic institutions as a social technology, like you expect technologies to get better over time, and yet here we are with kind of parliaments that work basically the same way they worked in the 1780s.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and one very famous world leader kind of sounded the death knell for liberal democracy recently. Whether we agree with him or not, I mean, what's been quite obvious is in the last few decades, whether it's wealth inequality or the fairness of elections.
There's definitely, I think, a lot of people who feel like, the big flashy buildings are going up in the places that have dictators. They're not going up in the places that don't. And like, what the hell, man? And how do we do better?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what's a realistic? I mean, what's a realistic next step on this?
Yeah, so in radical markets, Glenn introduced some of these ideas like Harberger taxes and quadratic voting were the big ones, and since then we came up with this thing called quadratic funding. Quadratic funding is really cool. I can probably go on a bit of a diatribe and explain it because it's quite interesting. And the basic idea, right, is that if you look at the problem of just how do we fund public goods in general, right? So public good being just any kind of project where if you do that project, it just has benefits across a wide group of people, and you can't kind of pick and choose which specific people it provides a benefit to. It's just out there. So that might include
roads, bridges,
roads, bridges, information public goods are huge in the 21st century. So just any open source software, anything that you put up on the internet for people to read, reducing the Earth's CO2 concentration.
I like
Very subtle plug for the MaiCoin STO carbon credit.
New scientific advancements, like all of these wonderful things, and there's just so much of it that just is of this format where either it's out there and it benefits all of humanity, or it doesn't get created, or it gets hidden and it benefits nobody. And traditional markets don't really do a good job of funding these things, basically because like when an individual is making a decision of like, do I do something that contributes to this thing, they can incorporate the benefit to themselves, but they have no incentive and even no information about the benefit that they are providing to all of these other people that project might benefit that are in far corners of the world that they're never going to meet. So what quadratic funding does is it basically says, let's come up with this mechanism where people can sign up if they have projects, and we're not going to have the public good police decide who's a real public good and who's not a real public good, right? Anyone can sign up projects, anyone can claim to be public goods, and anyone can contribute money to projects. And if you have multiple people that contribute money to a project, then the system detects that basically, hey, one person donated money to this project, and by doing that, when they donated money, they did two things, right? The first thing they did is they gave money to it, but the second thing they did is they signaled that they care about it and they benefit from the project. So if two people both donate money, then the system detects that the first person sent money to something which also benefits this other person that sent money to it. And so basically each one of these people contributed money to this project that clearly has also helped all of these other people. And so the quadratic funding mechanism applies this mathematical formula that basically calculates like what is the portion of the benefit that these participants would not have taken into account. And it basically takes some pool of money and just uses that as a subsidy. So it basically just automatically subsidizes people contributing to projects that other people contribute to, and so people contributing to projects that also benefit large groups of other people.
Yeah.
So, and the nice thing about it is that it's this really elegant, kind of simple formula. It's like taking, for any project, the square roots of everyone's contributions, adding up the square roots, squaring the results, then taking the difference as a subsidy. So it feels like really nice and simple in that sense, and it feels like this nice kind of neutral institution, right? In the same way as the market is this nice neutral institution for like figuring out what private goods people care about, this thing is this nice neutral institution for figuring out what public goods people care about and directing money to them.
I was going to say, what about voting? Because I was watching the David Marcus grilling by the Senate Finance Committee this morning.
Yeah.
And whenever you see these like House Senate kind of grilling sessions, you're struck with the impression that like maybe the best people aren't making it through this gauntlet. Yeah. You know,
yeah,
so
no,
how do you design? And clearly, left after the U.S. election, there's lots of talk of Russian meddling, and you know, and so.
Yeah,
so how do we, Russian Canadian meddling. Yeah,
you got the Canadian.
That's right, the Russian Canadian. So, what's your view on voting? Like, how do you structure that so it has a better outcome? Is that also quadratic voting? Is there something?
Yeah, I mean, like, I definitely think that, like, even if you like kind of lowercase d democratic values, that does not mean that you need to like kind of capital D democracy the way it's done in countries right now, right? Just this idea that we have these countries that are run by these once every 4 year kind of contests of good versus evil that everyone just like has to go on Twitter and yell about for like basically 18 months before the thing happens, to the point where everyone's yelling so hard that it makes Zuko start blocking everyone. And then at the end of the whole process, each individual basically only has the ability to provide one bit of input into the process.
Right.
And like it's clearly just so far from optimal, and it's even so far from satisfying kind of the stated values of the people that wants to participate in these kinds of systems, that we clearly need better alternatives.
So how do we regress between where we are now and what radical markets espouses, right? Because it's not a straight shot. And to kind of riff on the Libra hearings in the U.S. Congress, your opinion, just right off the bat, is it a wolf in sheep's clothing, or is it a meaningful first step?
Is it even a cryptocurrency from like? Yeah.
And Libra is interesting. Like my kind of read of the incentives here is basically that, like, first of all, Facebook is seeing that WeChat is getting into payments, and social media apps have to get into payments because that's kind of the big next step for them to expand. And Facebook has also been getting grilled hard for having a business model that's based on exploiting people's data. And so they probably have people inside that are just unhappy about that state of affairs, and they also know that that's going to be regulated more and more in the future, so they want to diversify beyond doing things like that, and there's plenty of business models and payments.
So you actually see there being kind of solid justification. It's not just a whimsical thing that Mark wants to do.
It's some of everything, right? So like, first of all, there's definitely solid justification for Facebook going into payments somehow. And blockchains are realistically the regulatorily simplest way for them to do that, and especially just to push it out across 100 countries.
Isn't the simplest way like WeChat just to bend the knee to a government and say?
Well, the problem is, there's just like so many governments, and like realistically, right? Like most of these governments are going to be quite slow and inefficient, and like the default is like, oh, go through this process of like figuring it out, and it'll take 5 years, and the thing that'll come out at the end is like totally uninteresting. So like taking the crypto-ish route to that, like I see that making sense for them, and like they're definitely getting a lot of regulatory flack now for it, but compared to what they would get had they just made a a payment banky thing, I think it's still considerably less.
Well, I mean, my understanding is they've gotten money transmitter or many services businesses licenses across all 50 states. So to go off Jesse's point, actually them doing a straight up WeChat is the straightforward thing to do.
It's doable maybe in the United States.
But it's only the United States.
Exactly.
And moreover, look at WeChat. I mean, it's not been successful outside of China.
In the other markets they're talking about, like Bank the Unbanked, and you're looking at India, these are countries with like either inflation problems or with capital control problems. And it just seems such a stretch that in some place like Venezuela, they're going to let Libra come in and have a competing currency. And I know David Marcus in his testimony today, or yesterday night, I guess he was really trying hard to point out that we don't want to be a competitor to central banks, but it's hard to see how they won't be if the system is anything like it was described in the white paper.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting just to kind of zoom out geopolitically a bit to see how corporations are starting to kind of assume government-like responsibilities.
Yeah.
And the thing that I highlighted on Twitter a couple of weeks ago was this kind of one incident that nobody seemed to pay much attention to. So like a lot of people know about how like there's these kind of genocides that are happening in Myanmar, and Facebook is being kind of blamed in part for facilitating that. But the thing that Facebook did last year is they actually censored some posts, some accounts that were controlled by the Myanmar military. So this is a corporation censoring a government on public interest grounds. Like, it's like such a massive kind of inversion of what normally happens. And like, you can definitely see, right, that like corporations, they want to get into the big boys game.
Yeah, that was one of the cool things about 2017 is that everything was about decentralization, right? We said we were going to decentralize everything, the internet and social media, and, but it doesn't feel like, like so much of the promises of 2017, it didn't follow through. So, what are the obstacles to having decentralized internet, decentralized social media, and how can that be a solution to some of the problems that we
I think in the short term, there's kind of simple pedestrian stuff that I'm worrying about a lot, which is just scalability, usability, privacy. Let's just get the basics to the point where the thing can just work.
Yeah.
So that's the first piece, right? Then once you have that, then you can start building decentralized applications that have good levels of usability, and then you can start kind of pushing things out more and more. You can come up with decentralized applications that kind of provide utility to more people. The next step, like once adoption becomes more mainstream, it's definitely going to get interesting.
I think micropayment solves a lot of the problem in itself, right? You're just you're flipping that kind of problematic business model on its head. It's where they're not selling your information. It's just people are paying for likes. Maybe that's part of it.
I'm actually kind of skeptical of the whole kind of micro-tipping revolution thing, because I think like it doesn't solve the fundamental economic issue. And the fundamental economic issue is that we're talking about public goods, right? And so if we're talking about a public good, then the amount that each individual person is willing to donate is going to be pretty small. Like most of the, even if you provide totally frictionless micro-tipping, well, 14 cents multiplied by a few thousand people, a few $100, well done, and that's if your thing got famous. So it's like the amount of money that you can get from just plain old simple donations is just like way too small, right? And so,
but isn't that how Patreon works? Like, aren't people making a lot of money by doing that?
Well, a few high-profile people are, but in practice, it's like basically nothing.
If you don't believe in relatively high-frequency, low-value payments, what other things?
So I guess I definitely believe in the value of making payments more frictionless. So like I visited Africa a few months ago, and I asked some local African community people, what do people use crypto for here in Africa? And the reply they gave was like the biggest kind of thing that people are using it for in practice right now is just you have people that are working remotely for companies in developed countries, and they're getting paid, and they want to move that money back to Africa. And cryptocurrencies are just the easiest way for them to do that. Now you might ask, well, haven't we been hearing news articles about remittance companies failing? But like, you're not getting the point. The whole point of crypto is that you don't need these intermediaries, right? Like you don't need a quote remittance company to do remittance. You just need cryptocurrency, and you send it to an address and a local exchange that you can use to just take the cryptocurrency and sell it.
Yeah.
And people are just doing that, and there's a lot of this kind of activity beneath the surface that is not even getting registered. So I think in the short term, there's a lot of value like that. And I'm definitely like, interested and care about solving problems like how do we incentivize kind of content publication and quality and all these nice things. So I'm pro those things in theory, but I guess I just, like, the problems are often harder than they seem to be at first glance, so you just have to kind of think harder about what the right solutions are.
Going back to ETH 2.0 for a sec, but
sure.
Looping it to this, these real use cases. I mean, in 1996, if we could probably imagine a world where we were streaming or downloading video on the internet, but it wasn't really until 2006 when the internet bandwidth, got there that YouTube became possible.
Yeah.
So ETH 2.0, 1000x throughput improvements. What can we imagine now, but then will actually happen when ETH 2.0 lands?
I mean, first of all, just all of these non-financial applications, like saving any kind of identity-related data, any like key revocations, certificates, and decentralized social media messages, like all of these tiny things that people want to just throw onto a blockchain just in case, but right now the fees are like way too high for that sort of thing. So there's a lot of projects now that have just gone nowhere that I think will just suddenly become viable when we have a lot more scalability. So that's the first thing. I mean, the second thing is just consumer payments becoming more frictionless and working better.
How about the decentralized internet, like DNS, IPFS, etc.?
Yeah, so ENS already exists, and ENS is like doing pretty well, but I think it'll definitely start doing even better. IPFS and like decentralized content hosting definitely is happening and will continue to happen, so happy about that. I think like identity management is also a big part of the puzzle. Like, can we have identities that work without Google or Facebook or whoever having the backdoor keys to them? And look, when you talk to these companies, they don't even necessarily want to have the backdoor keys in all of these cases. And like, honestly, they also just do a pretty terrible job of managing those the backdoor keys. Like, you might think, oh, well, you want centralization because if somebody's account gets hacked, then the company can help recover it. But like, in reality, like, I've had friends whose Gmail accounts get hacked, and they have an extremely hard time and often just fail to get the account back. So it's like, the extent to which centralized services right now just really fail at identity management, I think, is definitely understated. And decentralized alternatives are something that I'm really interested in. I mean, I continue to be a fan of this kind of social key recovery concept where you have a basically multi-sig between people like your friends. And you could also do like multi-institutional multi-sig and all of these things. So more experimentation with that I'm in favor of. And I think crypto has a chance of kind of contributing back to the world here because crypto creates high incentives to create and to also try to break systems for account security that are very high value. And if a thing is powerful enough to protect millions of dollars of crypto tokens for people, then it's also going to be secure enough to protect their personal lives for other use cases.
Yeah, pictures of their dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, like, going back to the Glenn Weil stuff, because I think that stuff is really interesting. You know, that's where like political science and economics and technology all come together. Is like that idea of private collective ownership. Do you think that conflicts at all with human nature? Like, I think it works in small societies like hunter-gatherer tribes, but what happens when you scale that up to like the U.S. where you've got 300 million people? Does it work at scale?
Yeah, and so I think there's an important distinction to be made between different kinds of collective ownership.
Okay.
So, like, there's definitely like this kind of unrealistically idealistic mindset that people have that pops up from time to time, which basically says something like, all of these kind of formalized systems are, like, whether it's private property or democracy or whatever, are attackable. And so let's have these mechanisms where you just create more room for people to make decisions by just talking to each other. And that works well in small groups and like up to Dunbar's number around 150. But if you try to scale it up beyond that, then you start realizing that like those kinds of systems have very mismatched incentives and power dynamics too, and they definitely end up very easily not scaling and collapsing in a lot of ways. And so that's it's definitely a big concern, right? But like with Harberger taxes, it's not quite the same thing because it's this. It is this kind of very specific and mathematically formalized form of partial common ownership that basically says that, look, we have property, but these property items have, like, the owners can set prices on them. They pay some percentage of whatever price they set every year, but then if you want to take some other thing, you can just buy it at whatever price they set it at. Yeah. And so instead of having a kind of infinitely strong right to exclude other people, it's more of a medium strong right to exclude other people, where another person always has the ability to kind of override it if they compensate you enough.
It almost sounds like contrary to free market, but it's actually like very, very free market, right?
That's exactly the thing that Glenn would say, right? So like it's definitely a formal mathematically defined mechanism, but the idea is that it's also, there's this kind of economic reasoning behind why it avoids some of the problems behind kind of private property regimes as they exist today. Yeah. Now, there's the practical question of like, will people get used to it? Yeah. And I definitely don't think it's a good idea to like go to have the like Xinzhou Yuan go, come together tomorrow and say, okay, we're going to stick a Harberger tax of 3% a year on everybody's house and everybody's car, and like you have to post prices.
The Wikipedia page would blow up.
Yeah, like if that happens, then like things will definitely go crazy very quickly. But even like Glenn doesn't advocate for that sort of thing either, right? Like what you want to do with Harberger taxes is you want to start with them by introducing them in areas that are, first of all, kind of more technocratically controlled already. So areas where property tends to currently be controlled by basically like corporations and rich people, because they're going to be able to handle the costs and kind of the common people would have more of the benefits.
So like Vancouver.
Maybe. Well, I'm not even thinking of houses, right?
Yep.
I'm even thinking of like, let's take intellectual property, for example.
Yep.
So imagine a world where if you want to have copyright on something, so first of all, like you don't get copyright by default. If you just take the lazy route and you write something, you don't have copyright, it's public domain. If you want to have copyright, you have to register it. And you have to go to a website and you have to register the thing, and you have to specify a price at which the thing is worth. Yeah. Then you have to pay 3% of that price every year. Yeah. Then if someone wants to, they can go on this website and they can, for any one of these items, and if they see something that's copyrighted and they see the price, they can just go and click pay the price. Yeah. And if they pay price, the original owner still has the right to use the thing for whatever they want, but then you also have an equal license, and you also have the ability to kind of potentially license that out to other people if you want, right? So now, if, for example, I want to just make a movie, and I want to include some song that existed like 40 years ago that record labels don't really care about that much, but like if they have an opportunity to try to gouge you for money, they would. Yeah. Then realistically, those companies are gonna either just not bother continuing to maintain the copyright at all, or they'll put it up at a pretty low price. Then you just go on the site, and you just click, and you get your license, and you can just use the music without worrying about it. Right.
There's a problem with the implementation of that, though, right? And I think you've addressed that. I read you wrote about it, but the MyEther wallet thing.
Right.
Right. So that if I'm MyEther wallet, Jesse Knut's, I have Jesse Knut's wallet. I don't have very much money, and then a scammer comes along who's got a lot of money.
So
right?
this is
outbid me.
Yeah, and so for domains, it's definitely different. But like, let's like explore the copyright case specifically, right?
Yeah.
So in this copyright case, What I'm suggesting is, like, it's not that you have the right to buy the copyright and take it from the original person. So I, as the original owner, can still know that I'll be able to use the thing in perpetuity for whatever I want, unless I like fully sign over the rights to someone else.
Yeah.
Like, if someone buys it out, they just have the right to use it themselves in addition to me.
Yeah.
Right. So now the idea would be that, like, you would have an incentive to basically only create a copyright and charge high prices on things that you expect you'll be able to make lots of money from, and as soon as you, like, the amount of money that you can make starts going down, you have the incentive to start lowering the kind of buy price that anyone could just buy the thing out, and eventually you'd want to just stop bothering to register it completely, right? So it, like, you can see how it sort of unlocks the market and opens up more possibilities for people to just go use these things that today they're just too scared to use because the process for getting licenses is way too complicated, and instead you just encourage this kind of one-click process, right? So this kind of copyright approach is one example, but even that requires some political reform, right? So if you want something that doesn't require any political reform, then this is one of the reasons why the blockchain space is so great, right? Because the blockchain space is this wonderful community of people that basically already agreed 11 years ago to participate in this weird economic experiment made by a possibly Japanese, possibly Australian guy.
I found physical proof just now that it was not an Australian guy, right? It's on that poster right there.
Yeah, so basically, like, trying to come up with use cases for these kinds of radical mechanisms, whether it's Harberger taxes, whether it's quadratic funding, whether it's something else, inside of a blockchain context. I think, like, there's definitely a lot of things that you can do, and these are small scale areas between relatively technically inclined people, and you can kind of start trying it out and seeing how it goes. And other, like, wider society can learn from it, and you go from there.
Well, where's the first practical trial for this?
So for quadratic funding, Gitcoin has been running a practical trial already, right? So they have this quadratic funding mechanism that they've already been running for 2 rounds, where people can set up projects, people can donate money to projects, and they use this quadratic matching formula to give subsidies to projects that lots of people contribute to. So it's been happening. I mean, we've even learned interesting things from that experiment. I mean, we're going to have another round fairly soon. So yeah, there's small-scale trials of this thing already.
So going back to the Zebra, because since Zebra is kind of similar with Ethereum protocol, so do you think that Zebra will attract a lot of developers from Ethereum community?
Technologically, Libra has a lot in common with Ethereum. I think Libra is definitely going to be more constrained politically because more eyes are on them. And so they have this advantage of 2 billion users, but they also have this disadvantage of, like, they can do less. And, like, the Ethereum chain, like, just in that sense, can kind of afford to be more liberal, no pun intended, and do more. Right. So, like, I think there's potentially even a lot of benefit from just making a bridge between these platforms so people can move between both more easily, for example.
Yeah, we're interested in building that bridge. You know, Libra did refer in their white paper to a more decentralized future. Maybe that's 200 nodes instead of 100. Or with this bridge, why is that not just the Ethereum blockchain, right?
And we'll see if they're able to. I mean, history is definitely littered with very tragic examples of systems that justified themselves as being transitional regimes that hope to become communist utopias. But and there are other cases that actually have kind of had a tight grip at the beginning to be more efficient when things are spinning up, and then kind of become more diffuse over time. I mean, even Ethereum itself, I think, has actually done a very good job of just becoming more diffuse over time. And yeah, we'll see.
What would be your words of advice for Mark as he undertakes what you've gone through the last few years?
And in general, I mean, I hope that, and I feel like they're willing to, and for Libra to kind of take a friendly and cooperative kind of, rather than hegemonic, obviously, kind of attitude with the crypto community and kind of try to appreciate what the strengths of both sides are and see how we can work together more.
So between that rock and the hard place that he's with the government, you know, where do you think is the rough right balance? I mean, he needs to protect users' privacy, at the same time adhere to AML strictures, and those things are fundamentally at odds, are they not? Right now they're taking this approach where the Libra-based blockchain has total crap for privacy, but then they have the Calibra wallet, and the Calibra wallet has basically the same privacy model as banks, which is that nobody sees anything publicly, but you have to KYC and you keep records, and they probably file plotting to file suspicious activity reports if they find suspicious activity worth reporting, and all of those things, which is definitely a pragmatic and realistic compromise at the moment. We'll see. A bit of a non sequitur, but you know, in the last nearly a decade, the term AI has come back into vogue. We first heard it in the 1960s. What are your views on, you know, the machine learning and AI developments of the last decade, and you know, then how far are we from the singularity?
And AI is definitely interesting, and it's made like a lot of progress over the last few years. I mean, even just GPT-2 is just, well, such a wonderful source of comedy. It's probably it's probably funnier per dollar than most of Hollywood. Like basically, it's this open AI bot that just where you can pass as input text that people have written, and it just
there's a pretty good
it outputs like predictive text, and like there's Vbotter that's
exactly.
It gives really nice and good quotes. And there's this really wonderful subreddit, Reddit/r/subsimulator GPT-2. You should just go there and then switch the sorting order from new to top with all time, and just like see the top view. It's hilarious. Actually, here, why not? We'll just
it's a very good impersonation.
We'll just be lazy and just like open it up really quickly. It's Reddit/subsimulator GPT-2. And so what they do is they basically have these AIs that are trained on each of the major subreddits, and they have threads. Okay, hold on. Create a new subreddit called r/askreddit where we just ask questions, period. And this was by Crazy Ideas GPT-2 bot. Second one, what do you call two people with the same name? Joe and John. Do you think AI will be the downfall of humanity or the savior? I think that it's okay to be a racist.
So you're saying we're pretty far off.
Yes. I mean, so
I think that's what you're saying.
Well, the really nice thing though is that like it's the kind of word by word structure is flawless. It creates grammatically perfect sentences that make sense in and of themselves, but it has just no idea what any of these have high quality.
But I've seen pretty good avatars of yourself. Like, you know, some random collection of words that together sound like Vitalik Buterin. So that's where
exactly. Like the nice thing about it is that it has these kind of sentences, but then the thing the AI is failing to do is like come up with things that are make sense as coherent like paragraphs and pages. Right. So like if you look through this some subreddit simulator, like I remember there was one post. That it was some weird thing of like my boyfriend moved in, like open bracket 20M close bracket, moved in with his girlfriend 22F, and she did something with their ex-husband, like this really. But then once you start scrolling down, like it starts contradicting itself a lot. Like there was one sentence that said something like. So like it was something like my boyfriend and his wife are officially married, but they're not technically married. And then you have these like it sounds coherent, but it just contradicts itself every sentence. So yeah, and there's definitely things that AIs are good at, and there's things that the AIs are not good at.
Sure. What about AI versus blockchain? Like these are like the ultimate VC buzzwords, and I feel like there's like there's an ideological spectrum there almost, where like we talked about this yesterday, where like AI is like small groups controlling large groups, right? China loves AI, and then blockchain is more about freedom, personal sovereignty. Like, is there a dichotomy there, or can those kind of work together?
It's interesting. And I remember 15 years ago when AI was supposed to be a pro-decentralization thing, because like we would have like decentralized rating and recommendation systems that would be able to figure out what products are good and what products are bad, and we don't need to have regulators anymore, and like all these other wonderful visions. And I mean, I do think that more of that has happened than some of the pessimists appreciate, but at the same time, like, it's clear that the dominant kind of thing that's happened is basically it's empowered central institutions to have like much more knowledge about everything that's going on, whereas the little people know much less about what's happening inside of them. And yeah, and there's definitely this kind of dichotomy between what's happening there and kind of cryptography in general, which is this interesting kind of last bastion of individuality and privacy in a lot of ways.
It really is,
I remember about 10 years ago I was reading a book from David Friedman, Milton's son, called Future Imperfect, where he is just giving a bunch of predictions about the future. And there was this one interesting chapter where he talks about basically the future of privacy, and he predicts it amazingly well. Like, he basically predicts a future where we'll have so much kind of mass surveillance in the physical world that like people will have a hard time, like we'll basically have to try hard to prevent the cameras from learning their passwords from just like noises that come off of their keywords, but at the same time things that happen within computers will be just perfectly encrypted and invisible, and so like you'll be able to use darknets to hire one single hitman, but then the hitman will be able basically do his deed, but then be arrested like literally 5 seconds after the fact. And so you have this really crazy dichotomy between kind of both higher levels of privacy digitally and lower levels of privacy in the physical world. And yeah, and I could totally see that kind of world being just the realistic thing that ends up happening.
Yeah.
So which one wins? I find it very interestingly ironic that China is number one pioneering the use of surveillance across many walks of daily life, but they're also leading the way on quantum encryption, which theoretically should safeguard our privacy.
Quantum, I mean, are they leading the way on quantum cryptography?
Well, they're shooting satellites up and they're doing a lot of that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a kind of very institutionally flavored and not sort of little people favoring technology. But like, the good news is, speaking of quantum, is that like encryption and blockchains and cryptography and even general purpose zero knowledge proofs are very safe from quantum computers. So like we'd have to change the algorithms, and new algorithms might be 5 times less efficient, but they do exist. So that's something that I personally am just very thankful and happy about. Yeah, and like we'll definitely have more of that. We'll see more of these really wonderful privacy technologies like general purpose zero knowledge proofs, and we'll see something that kind of allows people to continue to have a sphere of activity, at least online, that doesn't immediately turn into things that become like visible for the entire world and the powers on high to see. And I definitely think that having those things is really socially important. So,
shifting gears a little bit, one question I wanted to ask you was about POS versus POW, like the power consumption thing. Like, you've been pretty vocal about the power consumption issue there.
Yeah.
But a lot of the, mining now has evolved over the last couple of years, where it's going more towards green energy. A lot of the big miners are going to Norway, Iceland, Canada, where there's cheap hydro. And in a way that kind of incentivizes clean energy, right? Because a lot of these places are remote. It helps, smooth out the volatility in their power production. What are your thoughts on power consumption now? Are they the same as before, or do you?
Yeah, and it's definitely a bit of an improvement, like
Yeah.
because and potentially good for, like, if mining ends up taking this route that basically says that the only place where mining is viable is places where, like, these unique pockets where you have unusually cheap electricity, then that's even good for decentralization, because in general, like, arbitrage opportunities are a sort of naturally decentralized thing, and they just keep on popping in and popping out. But on the other hand, like, if you look at facts on the ground, like, that's the electricity, right? But the last time I did the math, 3/4 of the cost of mining isn't the electricity, it's producing the hardware. And producing the hardware is still this kind of highly centralized thing that basically happens in, like, is there ASIC manufacturing in Taiwan happening?
Yeah,
sure.
TSMC, the biggest
like,
in the world.
Basically, it's like either here or it's like our friends across the strait, right? And like
Korea.
Yeah, I mean,
Second tier goes to
too.
Korea.
Yeah, so it's like, and you know, you still needs to have this kind of very large amount of money to start getting in, and the manufacturing processes are not the most environmentally friendly thing in the world and all that. So that's one thing, right? But then another thing is that, like, the environmental externalities are one issue, but the other issue is that, like, even if global warming did not exist as a problem, like, there's still the facts that resources are being wasted. And resources being wasted is bad for society because it means that those resources aren't being used for other things, right? Like there's definitely people in the world that don't have enough electricity for, or even enough computing hardware for things, right? Like, as a trivial example, like, I know we've made a lot of gamers fairly unhappy because we took away their GPUs, but even
They're out there now. I can get them a deal on them if they want.
yeah, even other things, like, we're competing with scientific computing, and I'm sure there's places where the electricity competes with hospitals, and there's plenty of sort of important uses of both hardware and electricity that are happening. And if it's, like, basically, if $500 million worth of resources is being spent in one place, that means that it's not being spent in another place.
Yeah, but I think what sometimes happens, like with hydroelectric projects in particular, is that they're in very remote places. There's leakage to transfer that electricity, and sometimes just given the natural use now, like today, not versus what it could be in the future, it's not efficient. It's not worth it to do those projects.
Well, the problem still, though, is that, like, these ASICs do have to be running 24/7 because otherwise they're not going to be able to recoup the hardware costs.
Yeah.
And so there definitely aren't electricity places that are arbitrage opportunities 24/7, because, like, if that existed, then why would those places have been built in the first place? And there might be, but, like, much less, right? Like, the arbitrage opportunities would be more like, oh, we have these 24/7 production facilities, but they're running, like, they need to be used during the day, but they don't need to be used at night.
Yeah.
But the problem is that the ASIC miners have to be run at day or and at night, or otherwise they're uneconomical.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's been this holy grail, at least since I've been aware of Bitcoin, is just as, you know, general purpose GPUs have popped up in the last decade or so, so that you're not just rendering polygons for games, but you're folding proteins or searching for aliens, whatever it may be. Like, if we had a general purpose hashing, where the compute was not just for verifying for finding blocks. You have a flight to catch, Vitalik, but maybe you can help us wrap up on a optimistic note. What's an area that you're directly involved with that you see actually getting better, or, you know, improving the world in some concrete way?
And just going outside of, like, these blockchain cryptography privacy ish things that I care about, life extension research. That's, I mean, I've been following the community. I read Aubrey's book when I was like 13, and just looking at the progress and, like, the extent to which the community has been kind of growing and mainstreamifying itself and legitimizing itself in the last couple of years, it's huge progress. And you talk to people that are developing treatments, and they start saying things like, we have this array of things that, like, we don't entirely know which ones work and which ones don't, but we know that they're perfect, that they're not going to hurt you, and it looks like on average they might be able to already extend your life by 5 to 10 years possibly. And
at what level are these homeopathic things? Are they like gene editing? You know, what
so
level?
There's, like, specific substances that do things like reducing the rate at which like mitochondrial activity happens,
Sure.
potentially like increasing processes that repair certain kinds of cell damage.
Right.
Like so far, it's the thing that's happening is that there are these kind of very higher level things that are happening. Like they're not going to be able to fix everything, but they can at least like take the worst processes that we've identified and start mitigating them. And then the other thing that's happening is that there's these research on things called biomarkers, which is basically just a way of identifying more quickly like what the quote biological age of someone is.
Yeah.
And the main purpose of this is to just be able to then research and evaluate longevity treatments and get feedback back on a scale shorter than human lifetimes. So, yeah, and all of those things are happening. It seems like there's more funding, more progress. It's potentially close to hitting that kind of escape velocity where it doesn't need to be a charity thing and it can become an industry. So, yeah, and I'm optimistic about that.
Okay, so between lengthening your telomeres and kind of extending that health span,
Exactly.
and AI chatbots getting better.
Yeah.
Will you live forever, Vitalik?
I definitely hope so. Definitely not as a chatbot.
Not as a chatbot.
No.
Well, thank you so much for coming back to Taiwan, and come back soon.
Okay.
Great.
Thank
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hmm.